I want to say this up front. Uh, I have no intention of this being an AI podcast. I've noticed that like pretty much any podcast that tries to be like topical and tries to be relevant and contemporary, like half of them end up talking about AI these days. That's how it's been for like the past year. I have no intention of doing that, but I'm not making any promises. I'm not making any
Yeah,
promises.
yeah, and I may push that on you anyway because
Okay, yeah, fair enough, fair enough.
so it's podcasts or having a podcast is very it's kind of like a weird mix of like actual discussion and a little bit of theatrics because you do want to start with welcome to my podcast and blah blah blah. So that's but it feels odd for me in some weird way.
It is.
In any
Some
case,
of it is just extremely contrived, and others
yeah.
is not. And I don't actually have anything to plug, so I feel a little dumb going on podcasts. Like I don't have anything I don't have a SoundCloud. You're not going to find me
You're
on.
plugging
You're
yourself.
not going to find me on the artist formerly known as Twitter. Um, but, uh, but but yeah, as a medium, I do enjoy this. I want to say this up front.
Mhm.
Uh, I have no intention of this being an AI podcast. I've noticed that like pretty much any podcast that tries to be like topical and tries to be relevant and contemporary, like half of them end up talking about AI these days. That's how it's been for like the past year. I have no intention of doing that, but I'm not making any promises. I'm not making any
Yeah,
promises.
yeah, and I may push that on you anyway because
Okay, yeah, fair enough, fair enough. This whole
it's
period
topical
right now
for a
where we
good
are,
reason.
it reminds me very much of that. There's like a 5 year period in recent history when every podcast, whether it wanted to be or not, was invariably, inevitably going to be about Trump. Do you remember that period? Like, it doesn't matter. It could have been about, they wanted to talk about kitchen sink models, and eventually it would wind up being about Trump. I feel like it's like that now. Like, it doesn't matter what we want to talk about up front. It's gonna be AI.
Well,
I got some things to
I hope
say.
we're not going to
Hopefully
talk
that
about
won't be
that.
that. Yeah.
Right. I hope we don't talk about Trump. I don't. I Politics is not this podcast. That's for sure. Mostly because I'm ignorant on a lot of it, and like that whole phenomenon you're talking about. I was in South Korea, so I wasn't. I didn't listen to those podcasts. I don't even know if I listened to very many
You weren't
podcasts.
missing anything.
No, I was deep in my education mode, so I didn't really pay
Glad you
attention.
brought up education. Good segue,
Yeah,
John.
speaking of education, uh, Michael, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what topic you're interested in, what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay. Um, Today we are, well, let me introduce myself. I'm Michael Weber. I am an educator, specifically in biology education. I got into biology in a very roundabout way. I started initially teaching, I was teaching at a university, and it was at a university in South Korea. They wanted more classes taught in English, and they weren't too particular what those classes were about. So they told me you could teach whatever you want as long as it's in English. And I wanted to teach meme theory, which was kind of dying then. It might actually be dead now, but I was sort of catching the last of it. It was sort of in the days of Susan Blackmore and Daniel Dennett, and the sort of interesting things they had to say about the way information moves from person to person, from community to community. And the more I learned about that, the more I realized how grounded it is in biology. Uh, from the beginning, from the very get-go, the word meme was meant to be analogous to gene. So if you're gonna know anything about that kind of stuff, you really do have to know about evolutionary algorithms and how evolution works. So I wound up getting into biology, and the more I studied that, the more I enjoyed it, and I thought, you know what, I think I want to be a biology teacher. So that's what I transitioned into, and I've been doing that for almost a decade now, and I'm very happy doing it.
Awesome, awesome. So, I guess one of the things that you're concerned with, or at least that you've brought to my attention, is, and I guess this isn't necessarily specifically about biology, but it does. it does affect biology. It affects people and their lifespans and their health. And you've brought up the idea that there's something about education or being educated, and maybe this is continually being educated, and how it affects mortality. And from what I understand, at least from the paper that you allowed me to look at, because I wouldn't have found it if you hadn't done that. It was mostly adult mortality. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's what they were looking at. In fact, the,
So
the title of the paper that I forwarded to you is "The Effects of Education on Adult Mortality: A Global Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis." And there's so many people who contributed to this that we they don't even list authors; they list organizations.
mm,
It was a huge endeavor. In the interest of disclosure, it was at least in part funded by the Gates Foundation, which may turn
right,
off
yeah.
some people. I'm not one of those people. I think they do fine work over there. But people might have feelings about that, so I thought I'd mention it. But yeah, it was very eye-opening to me to read that study. I've long been a proponent of education as a way of social and economic development. I think when you look, I think the data is pretty clear on this. When you look at developing nations and you want to do something to help those nations develop, to help them go from being nations that are impoverished, nations that are struggling, to nations that are more developed, nations that have healthy economies with healthy people. One of the best ways to do that is with education, specifically with education for women. That is, if you're going to invest in something in a developing country, that definitely gets you the most bang for your buck. And the data is pretty clear on that. This is not just my crazy idea. This is an idea supported by a lot of people who work in this sector. So I've long believed in the power of education to uplift people socially and economically. I'd never really considered, well, in a sense, when you do that, you get healthier people. So I always figured there was this vague correlation between a group of people becoming more educated and then also becoming healthier. But I thought it was just that. I didn't think one necessarily, yeah, I thought it was sort of a very circuitous route. I never expected there to be any sort of causal relationship there. It just seems pretty obvious that if, when people are developing economically, when they are, improving their lives, when they have more money, they're going to be healthier. And education helps people have more money. The research on that is pretty clear too. If there's anything you want to do that's going to improve the earning potential of a group of people or even of an individual, uh, getting them an education is a pretty sure bet. So, the link between education and income in every country is pretty clear. And giving people educational opportunities generally leads to those people having higher incomes, and people with higher incomes are generally healthier. So I figured
So
it's a
can we
triangular
break it
way of
down
getting there. That's always what I thought it was.
right? Okay, so is that what the paper is really? It's not. Is it really pushing the? Okay, well, it's really more about income because I know that the one of the things that the study mentions is that they, at least in terms of their meta analysis, all most of it was from high income settings already. So this, I guess the data that they used
But not all.
was from
They had a
okay.
lot of data from people in lower economic situations, from people who do not have a lot of money. Here's the thing. Here's like that was those were my priors going into this. That yeah, sure, education will lead to healthier people, but in a very circuitous way. Uh, but the data from this and the conclusions from this particular study actually kind of blow that out of the water. They did a lot of regression analysis. They had a lot of data, and they used a few different statistical tools to do a lot of variations on a regression analysis, where you really look at two different variables and determine exactly how they're related, controlling for everything that you can control for. And with a large enough data set, there's an awful lot you can control for.
So
So
can you go
they
ahead and explain the term regression analysis?
Sure, sure. That's a statistical tool that we use to basically determine, first and foremost, is there a correlation between these two variables? And as you knock down more and more controlled variables, You filter out other factors, you control for other factors. The more you do that, the closer you get to being able to say, maybe there's actually a causal relationship here. Instead of A and B being correlated, maybe the A is actually causing B, or B is actually causing A. And they did have an extremely robust set of data here. They used a lot of data from the UN and from other NGO, a variety of NGO groups, and they controlled for an awful lot of these variables, including income. And looking at all this data, the conclusion that they came to is it's regardless of income, regardless of where you live, regardless of what part of the world you live in, education will improve your lifespan, hands down.
So I guess for me, my next question would be, well, there's several questions. Like, first of all, what kind of education are they talking about? How are they really picking and choosing what that is? I mean, for something that popped up in my head was something like trade schools versus actual university education, or are we talking about education right from the beginning when they're with their children? Is because I know there was. Um, so let's stop there and just maybe you can maybe enlighten me on some of those particular aspects. Like, what kind of education are they looking at? Is it your basic standardized institutional, like K through 12 type of education, university education?
Yeah, that's another thing in the study that kind of surprised me. They worked with a couple of different models that defined education. One of them was from the UN, another was from UNESCO, another was from another NGO. They did it a few different ways. Here was another surprising little bombshell in this study. Even if you accept that education improves lifespan, I would expect you would get diminishing returns on that. I would expect
Hmm.
you'd get most of the effect in high school. You'd see some effect in college. By the time you're looking at PhD, you might see a small measure over somebody without a PhD, but probably not much. There is a little bit of a diminish here, but not nearly as much as I expected. For the most part, every year of education is almost just as valuable as the year before it. And that was very surprising to me, especially for people for people who are high school graduates. The inescapable conclusion of this data, if it's to be believed, and I think it's a pretty strong argument, is that as a high school graduate, if you go on to college, you will. I mean, I'm already talking about in the individual. I want to avoid doing that because we're looking at large data sets and we're talking about populations. And that's something that I stress to my students. When you look at these things, you do have to look in terms of populations. I do a whole lesson on uh, the 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 different factors that go into obesity, and I let them know, like, hey, it's not okay to single out a single person for being overweight. That's not cool. You don't know what their genetics are. You don't know what their situation is. But you can look at a population. You can look at the U.S. population and say, yeah, okay, like a lot of people are overweight. But you can't zoom in to a particular person and say, yo, what are you doing? There's something wrong with you. So that's not how these statistics work. So I already caught myself talking about in the individual. I want to try to stop doing that over large populations. If a population of people, or even a large enough subset of that population, choose to pursue tertiary education, choose to pursue a bachelor's degree over those who don't in the same population, the ones that do are likely to live longer, which is
And I
a little
know
bit crazy,
you
but
mentioned,
that's what the data says.
and I meant you mentioned the lack of diminishing return, and what do you think is the cause for that? Like for me, it seems like okay, it's basically the need to like tackle continual change in your environment, and to do that, maybe your education, continual education, is beneficiary in that sense.
Yeah, I mean,
But
this part of what we're talking about does get very speculative when you start to ask why is that,
mm,
because that's not something they did not set out to answer that question. What they did, and before we try to answer that question, because at that point we are very much speculating, and I definitely do want to get to that, but I want to get the facts and the data down first before we start engaging our imaginations here. What they did was both a meta-analysis and also a systematic review. And those are two slightly different things. A meta-analysis is looking at taking different studies that answer similar questions. And if you're doing it right, then you have statistical tools that you'll use to sort of give more weight to one than the other. But you want to aggregate the data and come to some sort of conclusion. For example, if you study whether or not red wine is good for you or bad for you, because you'll find studies on both sides. Now, that doesn't mean that half those studies are wrong. What it means is that you need to factor that information in. You need to look at the quality of these studies, the sample size that they used, the methodology that they used. That should go into a good meta-analysis. It sometimes doesn't, unfortunately. But that sort of thing always goes into a good systematic review, where you have a particular question in mind and you look at studies that can help you answer that question, and you have protocols that you've established ahead of time for how you're going to evaluate those studies, what weight you're going to give to that data, and whether or not it really helps you answer that question, how you're going to evaluate their methodology. It's much better. Meta-analyses are good. Systematic reviews generally, I think, give you more solid answers. And here they did both. They did both, and they aggregated a lot of data. So I tend to have pretty high standards for this sort of thing, and I think I can't really find any fault with them. Maybe I just don't know enough statistics to see if and where they screwed up. But from where I'm sitting, it seems like they did a pretty good job, especially controlling for as many variables as they did, where they have data on how this effect happens at different income levels. You're going to live longer with education, whether you're a rich person or a poor person. Because often these longevity studies just tell us who's rich, right? I mean, they do. They say, oh, look, do this and you'll live longer. Okay. Well, yeah, you can do that if you're rich, like, so, yeah, exactly. This study didn't do that. This study looked at people in different income levels, in different situations, in different countries, and it found a very strong effect. And you know what? At this point, let's sort of characterize that effect. I don't want to get into numbers, so I'll speak qualitatively about it. Usually in longevity, if we're talking about longevity, there's things that always come up, right? Smoking, whether you smoke or not, drinking, whether you drink or not, exercise and diet. Those are like the big four that always come up if we're talking about longevity. They found education to be just as strong as any of them. That a person who has many years of education, there I go again, talking about a particular person,
Population.
a population of people who have many years of education have just as much of an edge on longevity as people who eat fruits and vegetables on a daily basis for their entire lives. And that's crazy. The effect is much bigger than I expected.
Yeah, that was something really interesting. Was that they weren't talking about like someone who eats casually fruits and vegetables, but it was like the extremes, which I found really interesting.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah, so education not only has a very measurable impact on longevity, but it's a big impact, much bigger than I expected.
Now, in the study, I do remember reading something about the fact that you say that, well, in some sense, being educated allowed people to make these type educated choices, such as
Mhm.
picking the right food and doing things like that. So that kind of, because they mentioned that, it makes me think that there's still some looseness to what education does compared to, like, say, income and healthy eating, in the sense that is it really, I mean, it sounds like maybe education comes first in many ways, like because you're educated, these other things are more accessible. Wealth is more accessible. Eating in a healthy way is more accessible. And again, maybe I'm already speculating a little bit here, but it seems like they're maybe that was part of their discussion. They're kind of echoing that idea a little bit. Or
Well,
would you
we can
disagree?
get into the speculation because I don't want to. We can do that just as long as we have it labeled. Hey, at this point, we are speculating.
Right.
Why is this huge effect? Again, like the study that I'm citing, they didn't try to answer that question. They just established the effect. I have my own opinions here. I suspect that it has a lot to do with a person's ability to evaluate information, because we are in an information saturated age. And I can't help but to think, drawing on recent examples in history, like the year 2020 and 2021, when we saw people really hurting in their health outcomes because they didn't know what to believe and what not to believe. And well, you know what? I'm being euphemistic here. I'm talking about people during COVID,
Right.
people who would, make up all kinds of crazy, believe all kinds of crazy things about vaccinations, while also believing all kinds of crazy things about, for example, drinking bleach and the efficacy of that to fight COVID. So I suspect that the link between education and longevity has a lot to do with a person's ability to evaluate information about their health.
So that again leads me to the type of education they're getting, um, and the fact that it is much more uh, based in critical thinking. But that's always something I feel like people talk about as lacking in education,
Yeah. Oh,
even
yeah,
in even
absolutely.
in some university settings. So I'm trying to see how that would be. I mean, I guess maybe it's because it's not just we're throwing information out when you educate, right? That's at least that's what it's not supposed to be, ideally.
I think,
Um,
yeah. I mean, don't get me. Sure, you talk to 100 educators and ask them, "Hey, are we teaching critical thinking in our classrooms?" And 99 of them are going to say no, and 95 of them will be unable to define critical thinking. But at the very least, what education does is it forces you to read things that you wouldn't otherwise read. You have to read viewpoints that you aren't yours. And often you are tested on how well you read those viewpoints. Uh, it does not allow you to retreat to your information bubble, to your confirmation bubble. You are education, whether you like it or not, if education will at some point make you read something that you don't want to read and that you're not comfortable with. I think that is just sort of baseline true. I know it's true for me. It's probably true for any educated person at some point had to read a book that they didn't like, but they still had to read it, and that's valuable. That's valuable. Um, Doing things that you hadn't planned on doing intellectually is valuable.
yeah,
So it might not be, a gold medal for critical thinking here, but it's a good place to start.
right. So in some sense, yeah, as you said, it's a good place to start. There's going to be some of it available to you, or at least in some sense. So I guess going back to a question I had before about things like the type of education, the inclination for education. Does the study address that those? It's hard to say like the motive. Trying to figure out a way to frame this question. They're seeing people who are educated and they're seeing people who are not educated, and they're comparing their health in some very vague, general way. At least I'm presenting it that way. Is there any correlation to any kind of political viewpoint in education?
I don't think they looked at that.
Because this was a world thing, right?
Right.
This was a global
This was a yeah,
global.
this was across many different countries and many different parts of the world. I don't yeah, I don't think they looked at that. I certainly don't think they looked at like the political legions of the school you went to. I think outside the US that's probably a lot less important. I think that's a very American centric question you're asking there, John. Where we have these litmus tests for different schools. Generally speaking, I think here's something that both sides of the aisle would agree on. Education tends to have a liberal slant. And part of that simply comes to exactly what I was saying before. You'll have to read something contrary to what you believe at some point. And I think that is an inherently liberal approach. In fact, I think it's maybe the only thing I like without reservation about the liberal approach. And I say this as someone who throughout his life has been on either side of the aisle. But like most people, with more education, I have tended to become more liberal. There's a reason for that. I think, being exposed to different viewpoints, I think inherently makes you more comfortable with different viewpoints. And I think that is definitely a strength of one particular party and not so much the other.
So there's some, I guess, in some like the overall idea is maybe if you could maybe mention or talk about some of the variables that they try to really address that we kind of would normally talk about, like things like, oh well, what's their political view, or what's their what were these people wealthy, with access to education, that kind of thing. What were some of the things that the constraints they put on that?
Sure, yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, income level is the big one. Like they saw that this effect is true regardless of your income level, whether you're a poor person or a rich person. Educated poor people tend to live longer than uneducated poor people, and that's true for wealthy people as well. But they did some very obvious stuff, well, maybe not so obvious, breaking it down by gender. The effect is strong for both males and females. Uh, Breaking it down in different age groups. Um, the effect seems to be strong in any particular age group with every age group. Um, yeah, and again, in different parts of the world, I don't exactly know precisely which countries they looked at. Like I said, they looked at a lot of UN data, they looked at a lot of NGO data. Um, so I don't think there might be some gaps there. They might not have looked in there might be parts of the world that they just missed because they didn't have data for it. Um, but they definitely got outside the weird. Are you familiar with that acronym?
Yeah, the
Yeah. This is
Western.
not a weird study. What is it? Western educated.
Yeah,
Uh,
I can't remember, Western educated something.
yeah. So,
I
for any listeners who don't know what I'm talking about,
it's an
there's this
acronym for
acronym weird
describing.
that sort of refers to the fact that so many university studies tend to do their studies on university students who are more likely to be of a certain income level, more likely to be in America. They're more likely to be white. They're more likely to be, um, so there's these huge blind spots that these studies have just by concentrating on the population that is most available to them. And this study really broke outside of that. They looked at they're well outside of the weird you know populations that uh, usually are part of these studies.
Yeah, that was good to see. I did look at a list, and there was definitely a section of Western countries, but they also had Asian countries and things like
It's
that.
pretty
It was a
robust.
huge
It's
list,
pretty
huge.
robust.
Yeah, it was massive, which is good to see. But other variables, like things like when they start their education, as opposed to like, is it earlier education versus, okay, so I'm starting my education later in life and I've got my GED, or I mean that's probably very American centric as well, but something like that where they're and again, type of education where does a trade does learning a particular trade have anything to do with that? Is it more very much like the broader spectrum kind of education?
I didn't look too specifically at that, but my understanding is that a year of trade school would count as a year of education, and they generally just measured education in years. Uh, but you know what? A qualitative study looking at the type of education might be really valuable and might provide more insights. I hope someone's listening and follows up with that.
That's your job. uh, yeah, and also, so there's a couple of things. I have to admit I'm fairly ignorant on the type of data they collected, in terms of they are looking at UN data. I'm not familiar with how UN and their standard. There's a particular standard that they use for UN, and what does that usually entail? What kind of data is that? Because I'm always very worried of things like surveys, and I talked about this before we started recording. Like survey data, I am very skeptical of in many ways, just because of the nature of it.
Because
And
it's
I'm
like
I'm
it's
not sure.
so often self-reported.
Self-reported, testimonial stuff is generally not so reliable in many ways. And maybe in some ways it's perfectly sufficient, but in something like this, I feel like maybe it's unavoidable too. That's also a thing that's a factor.
Well, one of the lead organizations that headed up this study also does a lot of epidemiological stuff. They're very well known for studying something called the global burden of disease and looking at how disease impacts countries differently. How this particular strain of flu is burdening France this much, but sub-Saharan Africa this much, and looking at that, and that is very that's not a survey. That's very epidemiological. That's relying on hospital data and things like that. And I think they used a lot of that data for measuring their health outcomes. So that might assuage some of your fears here. We're not looking at anecdotal stuff. We're certainly not looking at self-reported stuff. Pretty
How do you
solid,
feel today?
pretty solid medical data. Mortality rates. How many people died from X this year? How is that different in this country and the others? And who in particular is dying of X? And what commonalities do we see? So again, coming from the perspective that they did, the context of studying global burden of disease, I would have a lot of faith in the way that they would handle epidemiological data and mortality data.
Right. So their way of collecting data is something that, well, a they're very used to doing. It's just basically the same or similar style, and they're because they do it quite often and they do it well. A good history of it. Their techniques and methods have been probably worked out fairly well, where it is fairly accurate. They know which hospital to go to, what's reliable. They know which hospital records are reliable, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and is it a matter of just them saying, okay, we have this data, we know when they died, we know how they died, and we know what their education was. Ta-da! Or, or is there more to it than that?
That's where we start. And then you got to start running those regression analyses. You got to look at who's dying of what, what commonalities do they have, what factors do they have. A lot of these social questions that I have that I want answers to, I'm finding that the medical epidemiological studies provide a lot of insight into that. And as I grow older, I find myself wanting to look at that data first and foremost to answer, everyday questions. Looking at public health gives us a lot of insight to what's going on across a lot of different sectors. And in this case, we're seeing this a very strong relationship between education and public health. Um, so I'm glad that this approach is being taken to answer these questions that 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago might not have been as medically heavy as they are now. And maybe that bothers some people, but I like that. I find that more empirical. I find that more reliable. That's the kind of stuff that I want to inform my beliefs.
Right, right. Okay, so let's move on to some of the more speculative aspects, I guess, because I guess, and this is maybe just me being very ignorant. I'm still very interested in what makes. I guess we have the data. We have the data. We see that there's this. I mean, you're pushing for it's. There's definitely a causal, or at least a strong hint of a causal factor, rather than just a heavy correlation. Um, so what I guess I'd like to ask is, what's the next step? What do you see? Maybe not the specific people who did this study or institutions that did this study, but what do you see would be the next step in taking this information? What should we do with it?
Sure,
And this
yeah.
is, maybe something that's just your opinion or
Yeah, it is kind of speculative here. I mean, like, yeah, exactly. What is it about educated people that helps them live longer? Sure. I mean, let's get down to the nitty gritty here. Uh,
because I think that's the interesting question, right? Like
Absolutely,
that's really
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
why is that?
This is, I mean, the data is great, but it's just the way it is fuel for thought is even better, I think. Even if that thought is kind of speculative, it's a bit armchair. But one thing
Okay,
that
that's what philosophers do. So that's that's why I'm asking that
it's
question.
okay to do that in this context. Two guys on a podcast. I think we're safe. I don't. Anyway, One of the things that I've educated myself about in the last few years is the impact of health and exercise on academic performance. Because there's also quite a bit of data showing that if you want your children, if you want the kids at your school to do better in their classes, one thing you can do is make sure they're getting regular exercise. And there are some pretty solid reasons for this. I mean, the brain as an organ has some very high demands of the human body. Our brains, the big brains that we have, evolved during a time in our species history where we were getting pretty regular exercise, where we were walking between 15 and 20 kilometers a day, every day, eating a variety of foods that we had gathered. So getting a different variety of nutrition and just generally maintaining a healthy lifestyle. Uh, the brain has tremendous demands in terms of oxygen, in terms of blood sugar, uh, and maintaining good circulatory pathways. Uh, I kind of think I can't. The data isn't solid enough for me to say this with certainty, but I think that like being a healthy person helps you think better. To be blunt with it. And there's, like I said, this is not pure speculation. There's some pretty decent data to back that up. I certainly couldn't tell you how strong the effect is. Like, uh, there's no study out there linking hours jogged per week with IQ. Nothing like that. But there are just some very vague sort of correlations being, like if this group of children is getting regular
Concentration, focus, those
exercise,
kind of things.
we see better academic performance. It might not be because they're any healthier. Maybe it's just because they have excess energy that they burn off when they're exercising, helps them focus in class better. But we see it, sort of kind of see it with adults as well in university settings. So it's not super solid, but I do feel that there's this strong correlation between having a healthy body and having a well functioning mind. I'm now starting to wonder if the reverse is true. If maintaining a healthy mind through regular cognitive exercise, so to speak, helps us maintain overall health in our body. I'm not sure what the mechanism for that would be. This is very
Yeah, there's
speculative. But
a lot of regulatory aspects that the brain may manage that could benefit from being, from the brain being well exercised in that respect. I mean, the only issue I have is the brain is generally well exercised in many ways, regardless. In fact, physical exercise is a great example because you're moving your body a lot. You're doing a lot of different things that are physically demanding. Maybe your brain's not necessarily used to doing it at certain points, and they're like, "Oh, this is a new thing." And like already the idea of like there's a separation somehow. It's like it is the body. It's
sure,
part of the body, and
sure. Like
I feel
weightlifting
like that's
stimulates massive central nervous stimulation comes from weightlifting. You know,
right.
I'm not saying that you can bench press to make yourself smarter, but you are most certainly stimulating an awful lot of nerve endings. Uh,
Right.
yeah,
So yeah, I think that's definitely. I mean, in terms of a holistic approach, I think it's a good place to start for sure.
Anecdotally, like this is very anecdotal, so very very speculative. But I've had older students. By older, I mean 70, 80 years old. And one thing when I ask them, like, hey, what are you doing taking this class at your age? Just because I want to know what they say. They always say the same thing. They say that they have to keep their mind occupied to keep themselves healthy. This
Yeah,
is
I mean,
anecdotal, but
anecdotally, same here. My grandfather was extremely active. In many ways, as somebody who's 70, he lived to like 98, 99. And I mean, this is again anecdotal for sure. We're talking about an individual. We should be talking about populations. But but he was one person who constantly kept himself stimulated. He would learn computer programming at 70 and do all kinds of things throughout his life. And he was healthy right up until when he passed away. And it's something where I've seen the opposite in my family as well, where no stimulation, kind of stuck on their own, doing nothing, very quick. And again, anecdotal, but I think there's it's a good place to start investigating because it's at least as a curiosity.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it'd be nice to get some sort of quantitative currency to that to sort of start to tease out, like what sort of just a working definition of mental exercise would be great. Um,
right. Yep. Yeah. Get the terms solidified, defined, well defined, and then we can do go to those hospitals, check the records out.
what
So
units are we talking
before
about? Are we talking about minutes in spent doing Sudoku or whatever? Like
right.
let's get a unit on this, okay?
Versus crossword puzzles, of course,
Never
because
is
there
close.
may be a difference.
And, well,
So it kind of jumped to.
we're joking about
Go ahead.
this, but we're very rapidly approaching the point where the retired generation will also be the video game generation.
Yeah, yeah, that's really true. I've there are people who are older than me that played video games and still do, and it's like, wait a minute, it's not a young thing to do. That's a really interesting thing. Will that be something that increases longevity, or
I've sort
maybe
of
is
openly
that
said many
continued?
times that my retirement plan is just to catch up on all the video games I've missed. Because I do like video games, but I really rarely have the time for them. But
Yeah,
I
yeah,
like them.
same.
I wish I could play video games more. I mean, a lot of the new ones look really cool and fun. I want to
Yeah,
do that.
yeah.
So I've sort of
But
said,
you're
oh,
going to
when I
be in for a
retire,
big
I'm going to catch
surprise.
up on all those video games that I missed. Let me try this
You're
Call of
gonna
Duty
you're
thing
gonna
that
be in
everybody's always talking about.
a you're going to be in a big surprise because it's going to be something that like is so the new games at least will be so out of my element at least that I can't even begin to it's not like Mario. It's
Let me go back
completely
to Pong.
different.
Just give me Pong.
Okay, so I want to jump back to the study itself. Like, and you mentioned that okay, we're just seeing the data. We're not going to speculate on what this means necessarily. But do you have any inclination why the study was done? Why such a huge endeavor?
Well, I think let's go back to what I started saying at first. Education is the best bang for your buck if you want if you want to help a country become more economically developed. You know, educate them, especially educate their women. I think one of the key takeaways, perhaps the key takeaway from this study is money spent on education is money you are saving on healthcare. Like, if you want a healthy country, then get yourself an educated country. You know, I'm not sure exactly what the dollar ratio payoff is here, but money spent on education is going to pay for itself in terms of healthcare savings. This is, I mean, it's a bit more of a tricky situation in the USA, but in most of the world where healthcare educations are shared among the population, that is a big deal. So anything you can do that's going to reduce the healthcare burden on the public is money well spent. And this study to me very conclusively shows that money invested in education to help a population become more educated, to make sure that fewer and fewer people are left out of education, you're going to be seeing a return on that investment in terms of a healthier population, less of a healthcare burden on the public interest.
Okay, so there may be some partial motivation there, but not necessarily. And again, it's the study itself. Here's what we have. This basically what you said. Like if your education, your population is educated, the more fully your population is educated, the less likely you'll have to spend on, or the less you'll spend on healthcare. And there's no whys, there's no anything like that. That's not the nature of this particular study. And I'm pushing the why a lot because I feel like that's always really interesting. And I asked you like, what do you think of why this particular study's results are the way they are? Is there a way to take a non-speculative look at that question? What other empirical endeavor can we pursue to maybe get closer to that why?
Well, as always, you can't. with stuff like this because when you get to, I mean, the whole reason why we collect epidemiological data for stuff like this is because you can't do a controlled experiment with humans when you have good reason to believe that one of these groups will have a negative impact in their life, right? I mean, this is why we've had to study smoking through epidemiological studies for so many years, because we can't take a group of people and say, hey, we want you to start smoking because we want to see what happens versus this group that's not smoking. You can't do that. It's unethical. And obviously you can't withhold education from a group of people because you want to see how they turn out. Uh, maybe there might be
So it's not the same thing as cigarette smoking in the sense that we can take a look at we can do some models. We can take a model. We can of the lungs, if you will. We can make some kind of experiment where we take smoke and we see what happens to a model lung, and we say, okay, well, this looks like why smoking is bad for you. This is what happens to you when you smoke. That kind of thing we can do, but not necessarily with a person. We can't really do that, obviously, with a person. But are there any kind of like models we can construct that would be close enough to producing some kind of answer to that question?
I don't know. We don't even know how learning works, let alone education. Um, I said
Great point, by the way.
you can't do that with controlled groups. I don't know. Maybe you could. Maybe you could give scholarships to this one group and then study a group that didn't receive scholarships. That might. I don't know if that is ethical. I'm supposed to know these
Well,
things. I
you could
study
probably look at
philosophy,
people
but
who get scholarships and people who don't, who are pursuing the same education,
yeah.
and see whether or not follow their life. Not really manipulate them in any way, but kind of observe what happens and see. Okay, well, these people who didn't get a scholarship got the same education as these people who did. These people were particularly a little bit more wealthy, and they lived the same length of time, or roughly the same length of time in terms of the population. And that, of course, that would be necessarily a smaller population.
Even that, I don't think would give
So,
you. I don't think that would give us the answers that we want. Then we're just kind of just establish. We're just kind of studying the effect of education or the effect of wealth, and those are kind of things we already know. So teasing out the exact the mechanism of operation here, I don't have any good answers for you.
I think that's important to know. I think that's important to talk about with this particular kind of study because these kinds of studies exist. This kind of endeavors exist, and yeah, it is hard, especially for someone like me who's always like, why, to really not jump into this area of speculation because it feels there's no other way to do it to produce that answer. And in some sense, maybe I think you're more resistive of bothering with the answer, and I think maybe that's in some sense a very data driven scientific way to do it.
Well, I think it
um,
depends on whether or not you're looking at this from like a public policy perspective or from sort of a scientific perspective. Because in public policy, you don't necessarily need to know too much about why it works. You just need to know that it does work and it's ethical and it's feasible. Whereas a scientist, like they're the ones who got to get roll up their sleeves and figure out exactly why, which in turn will eventually inform public policy. They could find, well, the scientist will tease out, oh, it turns out what we actually need to do is just this. Uh,
and that may be important to know, but in something like this, I tend to see your point that it's quite difficult to really nail down some kind of methodological way of getting that
well,
answer. That's
like I said, this is eventually going to become an AI podcast, and there might be a way to do it in the future. Well, the last time you had me on as a guest, the notion of AI replacing teachers came up. And
right.
of course, myself and the other teacher who was on were both saying, well, no, there's no way an AI could do what we do. That's, that's ridiculous. I still believe that, but I don't think that's a good rebuttal for why AI will never replace teachers. Uh, just,
Do you have one?
no, I don't.
Have you come back punching? You've come back
Well,
punching
here's the
now.
thing.
You got
Even if
you
I
got an answer.
did, I don't think it would matter.
Hmm.
Even if I'm correct in my assertion that an AI will never be as effective as a human teacher, that might not change the fact that AIs will replace teachers. They might not be. as good, but all we need is for enough policymakers to decide that they're good enough.
Right.
And I can foresee a world in the near future where people people in less developed areas, people with less money, they get AI teachers, and the wealthy they can afford real teachers. I can certainly foresee a situation like that because we've done a lot of that in so many other sectors where people with fewer economic opportunities. I keep finding euphemisms of just saying poor people, so maybe I should just say poor people. Poor people just get these lesser versions of things. In some ways that's sort of already happened. In a lot of ways, that's already happened with our education system, where poor schools in poor areas have a lot of students per classroom. They have teachers who are less experienced. There are systemic reasons for this. I've worked in inner city schools, so I could talk about that, but that would be a whole other podcast. So the fact to me that AI classrooms might not be as effective in learning is probably not a good reason for why we will never see them. I think we might see them. And that might actually give us some insight to this question, albeit in a pretty terrible way. If we start seeing large health outcomes
Mm.
in students who have been educated by an AI versus students who have been educated by human beings, that would give us some insight to this question. And then we'd have to look closer, what's going on in these AI classrooms versus what's going on in a human classroom, a human
So it
controlled
really help.
classroom.
It would help define what makes, in some sense, what makes the human educator more effective. Or if that ends up being the case, I'm not sold on that. But I'm not necessarily pro AI.
You're not sold on
So,
that. No, I hear you.
right.
I would be curious to see how it shakes out. Like I said, I sort of tend to believe that the human teacher is going to do a better job, but no, there are definitely aspects of that. The AI will never get tired. The AI will never get frustrated. The AI will never, quit a school in frustration. And like yeah, there's definitely advantages that an AI has over a human teacher. But I also wonder if an AI is going to be able to make because learning for many students is a social activity, and there needs to be a social component for it to happen. You can't just throw facts at kids. That's not. It'll work for maybe 10 or 15% of them, but for the vast majority, it won't. Um,
Well, can you speak more to that? Because I know, like, even things like when you have online learning, where a lot of stuff is recorded, and maybe you'll get to talk to your professor online, maybe 15 minutes a semester or something like that. I mean, is that kind of the same idea in that sense, where there's less of that kind of like a figure that you look up to in that social sense that would be missing with AI. It would just literally be a tool, whereas I don't think teachers, at least hope or not, are considered tools.
yeah, and I mean that's something that we only do with adults, which uh,
Hmm.
seems seems obvious that we don't do that kind of stuff with kids. We recently had a grand experiment where we did online education with children. It was not good, right? They're referring to the COVID era as just lost years of education, and I still hear educators complaining that they have students who are below level. Because they're still seeing the after effects of that. Here we are 2 or 3 years on from that. They're still seeing students who are vastly below level for their age. Uh, so
And you contribute that to the fact that they were taught online rather than, I know, like, some people were just not, didn't even go to school for a while. Is
you can do that with an AI. You can do that online. You can sort of just not really be there. Whereas with a human teacher, I can tell when a student is checked out. That's pretty easy for me to do. For an online teacher, not so much, not so much. For an AI, I don't think so. I don't think, I mean, maybe, maybe not. I don't want to put limits on what AI can and can't do at this point, at this moment in history. That would be dumb. Uh, maybe
Yeah,
the
in
lecture would
terms
be
of
really
what
good at
the
that,
nature
but
of
I don't know. I feel like,
what is the nature of AI in teaching anyway? It's not just like text telling the student to do something. It could be anything, right? It could be, you know.
yeah, we don't need to limit it at that point. But I feel like regardless of what AI looks like in the near or far future, at any uh, having AI interacting with AI will really only train people to be better at interacting with AI.
Hmm.
Maybe that is what we need to do. Maybe that's what we're all going to be doing in 50 years from now. Maybe all jobs will be interacting with an AI. Um,
Well, it's interesting. I want to push back on that because I feel like that's something very similar to how people in general and social structure in itself works, where it's kind of, in a sense, we've become really good at adjusting ourselves to be better understood by others and adhering to social norms. And in some sense, that would just be basically the same old thing with AI. It would be better. It would start to learn how to adjust ourselves to the norms of the AI interaction, and I believe AI would also do the same, would adjust to the norms of the human interaction. So I feel like that would be almost in some weird way very similar to how we already are. And I'm not sure.
well, I can see that. That's a decent point. I mean, we've all adjusted the way that we communicate based on the medium. The word choice that I use in a text message are going to be different than in a face-to-face conversation because I know that the person can't see my face. They don't know what expression I'm making. They don't know there's no discourse marker to see when I'm being sarcastic. So I'm a lot less likely to make a sarcastic comment over text because I know it's hard to interpret that. So with each new form of communication that we develop, and I think AI, communicating with an AI is sort of a new form of education, excuse me, communication. Yeah, we adjust ourselves, and that's not a bad thing. That's just, the inevitable march of progress, I suppose.
Yeah, and I definitely think it's also a part of the social, just the way we are, I don't want to say wired, but the way social structure is in itself, especially when it comes to language and linguistics. Like just even if you're talking person to person, and you're in a different social environment from another one. There are differences in the way we interact, and I think that's all about adjusting norms and the language we use changes. And that's just so that the other person, so I can be better understood by the other person, and I feel like that. Yeah, I just feel like that is just an extension of what we already do. So for me, that feels less like a way we less of a worry, I guess, when it comes to AI and education. But I do think the biggest point for me that rings is what you meant, kind of what you mentioned earlier, is that there's some kind of mentorship that I feel like is, and that's like a social aspect that's missing, would be missing with AI. Something about, not necessarily like a teacher as a friend, but there's something about that. Like you have a child and I have a child, and there's something where we interact, and there's like not a hierarchy, but there's a certain level of trust and understanding that they impose on you.
Well, there's
If that
something to be
makes sense.
said for, human interaction, right? Like,
Right.
I guess that's the point. That's exactly what we're talking about. Um, yeah, maybe it is a bit ineffable. Maybe it's a je ne sais quoi that we just can't really quantify. Stuff like that always makes me nervous because I wonder if it's BS.
Right.
Yeah,
So
you have the same feeling, I
we
presume. Yeah.
we I'm not sure we could quantify it, but I don't. I'm not going to throw it out. It's just part of the ether kind of thing. There's definitely, and that's why I feel like AI is. It's again. I'm not saying it's a given, but it's definitely something very probable in my mind that AI could achieve as well, depending on the form of it. But so yeah, I just in terms of education, I'm not sure. I'm not. I feel strongly both ways.
Good question, John. When you are communicating with an AI, do you use please and thank you?
Um, I rarely communicate with AI, and when I do not use please and thank you because I do see AI at the moment as a tool, and that's I think a healthy place for it to be and maybe stay. I'm not sold on that, but I definitely, like I have my issues with what's going to happen next, particularly because from my line of work, that's going to go before teachers do. I can guarantee that, and that's because, in some sense, the idea of art and artistry and things like that. What is the je ne sais quoi of that? Like, what is it that I produce? Oh, I produced a photorealistic animation of a product. Hey, I can do that in less than a millisecond. So, what value do I have in that sense? I am a person, but that's not the same thing, right? Yes, I can interact with the stakeholders, the bosses, and things like that on a different level, but it's unnecessary if you think about business. It's in fact sometimes it's an impediment to business by interacting with me. So there's that aspect. I do see AI as a tool at this point, but what I guess is really interesting, maybe do we see teach will we ultimately see teachers that way in some sense? Be like, oh, well, we can have AI do it. So teachers are really just tools to educate our children. There's nothing more than that, and a tool can be replaced by better tools. And as you're saying, like, we'll ignore whatever else may be there, and we'll have this maybe less effective tool do the job for you. So that's where I feel about that. I don't know if that made sense or not.
No, no, that makes perfect sense. That seems like a reasonable trajectory for the next 10 or 20 years, whether we like it or not.
Right. So, at this point, I'm going to leave it open. Is there anything else you want to talk about? I did refer to Daniel Dennett's birthday being a couple days ago. If you feel like singing to him, feel free.
Well, let me check in with you because this is something that you and I have gone back and forth a lot over the years. Where do you stand right now in terms of consciousness?
Great question. That's hard. It's become more difficult to answer actually, I think for me. Very much delved a lot into the biology of the brain, in terms of, neuroscience, cognitive science, and I have a lot of issues with the idea of the brain being quote unquote computational. I don't like the model that neuroscience has been using in the past very much. I think it's great as a model if you're an engineer, but if you're a scientist delving into the why and how, I feel like it's kind of done its duty and it's time to move on or get more in depth into exactly what the mechanisms are. What I mean by that is like, you understand, like the computational mind. Most people think, even the shirt I'm wearing, which says like I'm thinking, has this like computer analogy, right? And the analogy of a computer in the mind, I feel like is um, worn out its welcome. It's done a really good job in many ways, but again, like I feel like it's more of an engineering kind of thing where it's modeling something, to be used for certain things, and I think consciousness has kind of eluded that use, and it's more of, I don't know. It's hard to explain. Like, yeah, I used to be very much like it's very much like a computer. It's about information processing, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some still lingering thoughts aligning with that, but it's changed a little bit. So let me turn the question back to you. Where are you with with consciousness?
I have not solved consciousness since the last time we
Not
spoke
yet.
about it. Uh,
I had high hopes.
I'm still basically where I was, a decade ago or 2 decades ago. I think just today or yesterday, an old post came up in my social media that involved Dennett, and it was not a reference to his birthday, so I don't know why. I guess it's just a coincidence that it came up on this particular day. It was a quote from him. I'm going to paraphrase it. It was something to the effect uh, of all the trillions of cells in your body, none of them know who you are, and none of them care. And there were some of my friends who sort of took offense to that, and others who just didn't understand any idea what he's talking about. But you were on that thread, sort of explaining a bit about of your take on it, and as was I. I talked about emergence, and that's um, that
Another thing
consciousness
that
is this sort of weird illusion that has just come up from the sheer complexity that we have of being able to model other systems within our own brain and having competing factions within our brain. Yeah, I think really the only change in my thinking since you and I last saw each other face to face was I read a book called Incognito. I'm trying to remember the name of the author, Eagleman,
oh
perhaps.
yeah, yeah, I think I read that one a while back.
He talks a lot about the brain is sort of a congress of different appetites, different desires, different goals, different outcomes that they're working towards, and they're all just sort of blended together. And your consciousness is just kind of the one that seems to be winning at the moment.
Yeah, it's very much like Daniel Dennett's not multiple drafts, a little bit like that, but it's about that the voting. I can't remember the exact analogy, but it's something about if this particular thing outvotes the others
Yeah,
or wins the vote, then it's produced. So that's the mechanism for producing consciousness, right? But there's always that what is that the hard problem aspect of what is it? What is the feeling? What the hell is the feeling of being, the affect? And that's something I've been delving into a lot. Like for me, it was always, well, that is the feeling. Like the feeling is this winning vote, but that's
that's hard
hard
to
to argue
square
scientifically.
when the winning vote could be the result of the fact that you happen to be very hungry at that moment. So
Right.
you didn't you skipped breakfast, so now you are literally a different person. It gets weird, right?
It does get weird. And like part of my master's dissertation was spoke a little bit about some fairly new findings regarding, for lack of a better term, the not the limbic system, but like the most animal part of your brain, which all vertebrates have, as being the root of affect, the root of feeling. And they did like a double dissociative test or experiment where basically, or they used data that suggested a double dissociation, where you have people who have no cortical structure at all, or most of it, almost all of it is gone, but they still retain part of the not the I always forget words.
Like the limbic system, the amygdala, the brainstem, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's mostly the brainstem. And what they found was that that you could still emote, you could still feel, you could still or at least there were signs of it. We don't know whether people are really feeling because we're not them, but there's the
Right.
idea that they're showing those archetypal emotions, even though they have no cortex whatsoever. Um, that can't do very much other than that, in fact. And then when you remove that part of your brain, you're gone consciously. You're not conscious at all. So there's this double dissociation which they use to talk about the fact that affect and that particular thing that produces affect is really the root of what we consider consciousness, because consciousness is supposedly the feeling. It's not the intellectual prowess or any of that other things, of those other things. Those things do aid in creating a larger consciousness in some sense, or more. When I say larger, I don't mean like mystical sense, but more. And a good way to put it is you have more options to choose, whether it's not just on and off. It's not just here's light, here's dark, or this is good, this is bad. There's more nuanced, and that's because the brain the cortex helps make that more complicated because it needs to be more complicated to deal with a complicated world, et cetera, et cetera. So that was interesting. So I've looked at more at the affect aspect of consciousness because I feel like that's really what everybody's talking about, and the word consciousness is very confusing for that reason. There are people talking about different things when when they think they're meaning the same thing.
I have very much changed my mind in the last 20 years or so on consciousness and emotion in animals. When I was an
Hmm.
undergrad, I sort of believed that human beings had this grand, sophisticated mental life, and animals simply didn't, that they were just sort of walking around on autopilot. As I've studied biology more, I see more and more evidence of animals having pretty strong emotional lives,
Hmm.
especially in mammals, very easy to see in mammals. But birds as well. Birds have some extremely complicated social interactions. Just some of the mating rituals in birds are just baffling to me. That animals with brains the size of a nut can perform these incredibly complex social rituals. And even in reptiles, which I kind of like, I don't like reptiles. Even in reptiles, there's certain species that have strong kinship. They're not all, there's this stereotype that reptiles are loners, that, but no, there are species of reptile that have surprisingly strong kinship bonds and surprisingly strong social interactions. So I don't think humans are alone in this whole consciousness thing. Uh, there's plenty of ink spilled on degrees of consciousness and things like
Right.
that. But it's been a yeah. It seems like the more I learn about animals, the more I learn that they are emotionally and intellectually more complicated than I ever thought they were.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think but again, there's a lot of problematic studies as well, where they talk about mind reading from animals. For instance, like you have a chimpanzee that is supposedly, oh, well, this chimpanzee, we have evidence that this chimpanzee is um, guessing what the other person is thinking. Uh, like, okay, they're thinking this, and that's why I'm going to go for the banana because they don't see me. So, and I don't know if that's quite true, and a lot of that is to do with the language because it comes from psychology rather than uh, a more biological aspect in some sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Um,
bad studies out there. I don't know if you caught this, but there was some science news that came out a couple of years ago about Coco the gorilla. Remember Coco?
yep,
Learned 100 different signs in sign language. Well, somebody went back and looked at the data, and turns out no. No, it was mostly just the researchers just sort of like, oh, look at that, that was a sign. Look, just sort of
yeah, yeah,
inserting their own psychology into it. A lot of confirmation bias. Just a lot
yeah,
of people who really wanted this gorilla to be signing in sign language, and just vastly overstating what was actually happening.
yeah. A lot of projection, and I think even studies, and I'm mentioning studies that are actually trying to particularly try to reduce those variables. We're still plagued with, in some sense, your cognitive folk psychological terminology. Like this chimpanzee was imagining this other person thinking, and I just don't see necessarily that they have that advanced imagination or that aspect because I feel like that is a linguistic aspect. It doesn't mean that they don't have mechanisms that are very similar in the sense that they're able to watch the behavior of the other chimpanzee and recognize that behavior as meaning something like they're not seeing me because their body's turned this way. It's very different than saying, oh, they don't know that I'm there. Do you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
and that's something I think that the language there becomes very problematic because what happens is when you look at the results, they claim that the chimpanzee has all the same things that we do in this, and it's just not necessarily clearly not the case, but it's definitely there's a like there's a strong argument for it not being the case. And again, that's kind of pushing away from saying that animals have a very strong intellectual, mind reading, social ability that we do. And I think that doesn't mean that they don't have emotions and social interactions that are very similar. And I think again, by talking about affect specifically is you know that's a part of emotion. Like emotions can be considered complicated affects, and affects is just simply you have your feeling sensations of this feels good, this feels bad, and then particular types of good and bad, right? Like hunger versus satiation. And those have a particular feeling. There's something it's like to have that. And I think that we can't automatically just say that, yeah, everything in life has that because nobody knows. I don't even know you have it. But I think we could, in some sense, I feel comfortable saying that that's the case for most animals, that they do have quite a bit, quite an array of affects. Emotions are different because we're just talking about definition in some sense, but emotions I feel like are um, strongly associated with human beings in the sense that we label these affects in certain ways, and then in that sense we construct different ones based on language, if that makes any sense. So it's kind of like they have something similar, but we don't want to call it an emotion because that would involve language, and that's where people are now in the discussion. And I kind of get it, but I also kind of see, okay, well, there's a root to it that's still very valid that they have that's similar, and just because we're not calling it an emotion doesn't mean it's not felt in many ways the same way. So I'll give you an example. Like a child may feel something, but they don't know how to label it quite the way we would. Like
Mhm.
I feel frustrated, but they don't know what the word frustrated is. They don't know the definition, but they feel something, and you can visibly see that they act in a way that's similar to frustration, but they wouldn't be able to tell you that's frustration. Um, does that affect the actual feeling of it? If they suddenly got the label, this is what it is, and they can use it and categorize it in a very narrow sense from now on, does that affect the way that they actually feel it? And um, what I mean by that is, in some sense, I think that might be the case, but not to a huge degree. So, an animal who looks like they're frustrated, we could say they're frustrated, um, but in some sense, we don't want to. We want to be cautious about how we use that word. So, there's a whole discussion around that I'm kind of into. I'm not really sure where I sway on it, but um, in any case, I feel like there's still definitely uh, a spectrum of what consciousness is in the animal kingdom or life. Anyway, that was very long-winded.
Oh, it's good stuff.
um, cool. Again, I want to just thank you very much for being on here. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I definitely enjoyed your insight onto the study.
Always, John.
Could you go ahead
It's
and repeat
always a
the
pleasure
name
to
of the
speak with
study?
you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I appreciate you giving me a bit of a platform and letting me rant about the things that have been going through my head lately. And I always appreciate hearing your thoughts on my thoughts and just hearing your thoughts in general. It's always a pleasure for me.
That's likewise, likewise.